why PEFC? What's the case with PEFC? PEFC is the world's only global not-for-profit forest certification system. All of our activities are not-for-profit. We're based in Geneva, and we are an alliance of national forest certification systems. We provide global representation and an international chain of custody. The Australian Forestry Standard, which is part of Standards Australia, is a national forest certification system which has met the 207 criterion requirements which we have, where the Australian Forestry Standard has been assessed against those in a global consultation by independent assessors, and a report has been written and made put available on the website so that everyone can see how the Australian Forestry Standard has coped against each one of the 207 requirements. In fact, as part of our processes, we believe in openness and transparency in assessment of all certification systems. So if you wanted to have a look at requirement 152 across the Malaysian, Australian, and Finnish scheme, you can do so in the PEFC system. The full reports are there, including all of the comments. And we believe that's important to have these reports available so that people can understand the debate and see what the issues are. And it adds credibility and robustness to the whole system. We are a voluntary mechanism for promoting sustainable forest management through accredited third-party certification. So the certification bodies that are certifying you to the Australian Forestry Standard are accredited by JASANS. And JASANS is part of the International Accreditation Forum, which basically is a global community of accreditation bodies who deal with all sorts of areas, whether it be pharmaceuticals, health and safety, and a whole range of other industries, management, performance, and so on. So it's a wide community, all based on ISO, the International Standards Organization's requirements. And we are the world's largest system, and we provide 2/3 of the world's certified sustainable forest management. And one area which I emphasize quite a lot is actually that it is a system of choice for family forest owners. That means small family forest owners who maybe only harvest or do operations in the forest once in a lifetime have chosen to do PEFC certification, maybe for altruistic reasons, also maybe for the market, but I think primarily for altruistic reasons. We have over 1 million family forest owners certified under the PEFC system. The average size of those sort of forests are about 5 hectares, just to give you an idea of what we're talking about. And we will see more of that happening in the future. Our activities are obviously to develop this international standard, and we don't just make up the standard. We're actually using the processes which grew out of Rio. This week we have the Rio +20 conference taking place on sustainable development. But Rio failed to provide a legally binding instrument for forests when it produced one of the 4 documents in 1992. And because of that, the voluntary sector decided that we'd have to take those principles and actually see whether we can work these up into criteria and indicators and operational level guidelines, and ultimately into forest management standards. These intergovernmental processes are supported by over 189 governments, representing over 85% of the world's forest surface, and we decided to use that as the basis of what is a credible international sustainable forest management standard, and that's how all of the systems have been built up. So you'll find that the Australian Forestry Standard not only meets the Montreal process, but it also meets the Ministerial Conference on the Protection of Forests in Europe, which was probably the most advanced intergovernmental process, which we used then as the benchmark for the building blocks for each of the forest certification systems. We expand sustainable forest management and awareness of certification by having a whole range of projects. One of the projects that we're running at the moment is with Indigenous peoples in the Philippines to see what forest certification can actually mean to them, and whether it can add value to the kind of work that they're doing and their interactions with society on a wider basis. And they're much more interested in the social dialogue which comes out of forest certification than actually any products as such. And of course, we are involved in the promotion of forest certification and the use of certified timber through communications and advocacies and collaboration and a whole range of region and country-specific activities. Forest certification is divided into two particular aspects: those things that happen within the forest, and then those parts that happen from the forest until further down the supply chain. Within the forest, of course, we have to ensure that social and economic environmental issues are taken into consideration and that there is an appropriate balance for those, and that forms then the sustainability benchmark. And some of the most recent revisions that we've done, Richard was talking about the fact that the Australian Forestry Standard is just in the process of undergoing a revision. Even at international level, we consistently and regularly revising our processes to make sure that we have the latest scientific knowledge, the best experience and best practice built into our international benchmarks. And it's a part of an ongoing process. The latest one finished at the end of 2010. And we require compliance, for example, with all of the ILO conventions. People very often make references to the ILO conventions. Not every country has ratified them, so we don't just say have the ILO conventions wherever they're ratified. If a country doesn't have the ILO conventions ratified, the standard needs to reflect that, because we're talking about the overall image of all of you who are using products from sustainably managed forests. So if you don't respect the ILO conventions, let's say in India or in China, but you respect them here in Australia, then that is at some stage going to have a detrimental impact when India and China are PEFC certified, because then your questions are we dealing with a level playing field? So we insist that all national standards have the fundamental ILO conventions built in, and we're the only international system that requires that. We have made sure through our bottom-up approach, by the fact that we deal with stakeholders at a national level, interpreting these international benchmarks, but to a national situations and national conditions, that the forest certification systems are tailored to the specific needs, ranging from companies to family and community-owned forests. So there's a lot more diversity in the structures of PEFC documentation around the world, but they all meet these benchmarks, and you can actually check how each standard meets the benchmarks. And it's created a lot of confusions, particularly in the mind of public procurement officials who would rather see, everything written down in environmental chapters, chapter 1, the social chapters, chapter 2. But we realize that the standards have to be written in a way that makes sense to all of the national stakeholders, and then it has to be assessed internationally to make sure that all the elements are covered properly. We set the highest standard for forest certification. We've been working heavily on maintaining and enhancing biodiversity, and one of the arguments that I keep seeing here is about when people want to compare and contrast international systems and they talk about high conservation value forests. It's true that we don't use the term high conservation value forests because it's not a UN term. It's not even an internationally recognized term within any of the forestry and UN processes, and therefore we use terms like ecologically important areas, but we know, and we've done the cross-checks, that basically everything that's covered in high conservation value forests is also covered in that terminology. So if we are now talking that the terminology is wrong, that's one thing, but if you're actually talking about what do the forests actually deliver, then they also deliver the values of a high conservation value forest within PEFC. Of course, the issues of conversions, we prohibit that. Most hazardous chemicals, GMOs, workers' rights and welfare has been strengthened. We encourage the use of local employment, and we recognize the principles of free, prior, informed consent, and the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And sometimes here we have to also make sure that we use some other terminology because when people are comparing and contrasting systems and what they deliver, they will ask some questions like, does it cover ILO 169, which is on Indigenous people's rights? And if you haven't written that you cover it, you don't get a tick. But actually, the Universal Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People goes much further than 169. But it's it's also, a lot of this has to do with how you communicate and how you provide information to people, that these, some of these conventions have to be added in as well, even though you have conventions which go much further than the ones that people look as the benchmark for assessing and comparing certification systems. Of course, provisions for consultation with local people and stakeholders, and there's also the issue of making sure that stakeholders are appropriately involved within a certification and standard setting process. PEFC is an organization which is based on social dialogue, and we believe very strongly that if people can get around the table and talk and resolve issues, then you're going to have a much more sustainable approach even to sustainable forest management practices than if you don't do that. So the social dialogue is very, very important to us, and we now require each standard which is set locally to undertake a stakeholder mapping exercise to find out which stakeholders are not there and why they're not there, and if there's anything that we can do to bring them to the table. So if we now look at Finland, for example, Finland started off with only 12 stakeholder groups around the table. At its next revision, it brought together about 27 stakeholder groups, and I believe that the current level is now 43 stakeholder groups were involved in the latest revision of the standards. So it's an ongoing process as more and more people feel comfortable and get involved in national and local processes which can be recognized internationally. Here's PEFC's presence globally. You'll see that most of the certified forest areas are in the northern hemisphere. We have 35 member countries which have national standards, of which 30 have been assessed. So the light green ones have not yet been assessed, but are in the process of developing their schemes, and they will submit them shortly. And the dark colored ones all have national systems. And we've got 17 new countries have lined up to become part of the PEFC process. So we started off with about 9, and now we're at 35, and there's 17 new ones. And one of them is actually, this is the dark color here is Malaysia, and of course underneath is Indonesia. Indonesia has recently submitted an application to have its national system taken into PEFC membership first of all, and then endorsed or assessed to see whether it meets our requirements, and if it does meet the requirements, then to have that endorsed. And that's a fairly recent development. We'll be considering that at our General Assembly in November, but the board accepted the application recommended to our members just as recently as 3 weeks ago. Then we have developments in China. China became a member last year of the PEFC Council. It is in the process of making finalizations to its system. China is quite important because they have about 195 million hectares of forests, with a long-term intention that all of those forests will become certified. The state Forest Service has actually, it was actually Hu Jintao who announced that they are planning another 40 million hectares of plantation forestry over the next 20 years. They already have 60 million hectares of plantation forestry, and they recently announced that they were going to make sure that certification covered not only the state forests but also the community forests. And to come back to my theme about family and family-owned forests, that covers about 175 million family forest owners, where the intention is to get them into certification. The government intends to provide funding and support for getting people into certification, and they have announced that they expect that by 2020, anyone who is importing timber into China or exporting will have to have a chain of custody. They've decided that they're going to be using as the basis the PEFC International chain of custody. China is a huge driver there. They regard a lot of the activities that take place in North America and in Europe as barriers to trade. So they are now determined to ensure that their forestry practices are up to the international benchmarks, and that will also help level the playing field if one then gets to a situation that forests managed, whether it's in Indonesia or in China or in Australia, all have to meet the same level of requirements for sustainable forest management. So China is a huge driver there. All the companies that are related to and linked in with government ownership are going to be required to have certification and chain of custody certification. The impact has been that many countries around about China are now very keen to develop certification systems, such as India, which is now in the process of developing its national forest certification system. And before I came out here, we were getting inquiries from South Korea, Thailand. As I said, we are now 17 countries that are interested in developing national systems and participating in this global movement to expand sustainable forest management and its certification. So some of the other countries in Europe, we already have quite a lot of forests, but we're seeing that in the Balkans and Hungary, there's some interest in forest certification, as there is in Mexico and in Bolivia. So a lot more forests going to be turning up in Latin America. The latest one that was endorsed there, and it was mainly because of actually the paper industry, was the one in Uruguay. It's just recently been endorsed, and Argentina's very keenly looking to have its system endorsed as well, and is in the final stages of the preparation of its national system. I have to say, when we look at forests and forest-based products, we have to always we have to bear in mind that actually the paper sector is much further ahead than any other sector. Already 45% of everything that is traded internationally in the pulp and paper sector goes through a chain of custody, whether it's PEFC or FSC, and the majority of that's PEFC. And that is expected to go up within the next 5 years to 55%. So the paper sector is much further ahead because the global average is only about 25%.